Hi guys, it's Joey and this is this week's Celtic Calling, and this week we will be talking about the Celtic god Manannan Mac Art. And I'm going to precursor this video again by saying it's just my research, my opinions, what I have come across, what was important and potent to me, and me discussing that a little bit. This is by no means an extensive guide. It could be seen as a jumping off point if something inspires you or resonates with you to go investigate that a little bit more. It is by no means, you know, a be all and end all guide, but there we go. So Manannan, Manannan, son of Lir, was an Irish sea god. Lir being a Gaelic word for sea or ocean. An eponymous hero god of the Manxmen from the Isle of Man, whose island was named after him. He's also directly related to the Welsh sea god Manannan Fab Lir. I may be saying that one wrong. I didn't realise I had to look up the pronunciations as much as possible, and I hadn't noticed that one. Like many of the primal ocean gods, Manannan was older than the Danann sky gods, yet was considered one of them. This suggests a primordial origin similar to the Norse Aegir. Manannan rode his horse or chariot across the tops of the waves, as did Poseidon and the Aegir. He also had a mantle and a helm of invisibility or flames, and an unfailing sword. That's information from manannan.net. Okay, is there anything we need to touch on so far? I think the idea of the primordial origin is really fascinating. We're going to see something in the very last myth actually that we look at, and how this god sort of expanded through time, and the stories of the onset of Christianity and him come into it at the end. But there's also the way in which humans throughout time embrace, I guess that works, gods and their importance to certain elements, and how the sea, particularly in islands, had this huge importance, this huge mystery, and still does. And whereas there becomes this transference to the gods being in the sky because of that coming across from other cultures, notably Greek culture into Roman culture, and obviously with the conquering of the civilized and uncivilized worlds, I guess, that influence coming into things. And it's interesting to consider whether or not the islands considered the realm of the sea more important than the realm of the sky, or just as important, maybe because they were an island. I don't know, is it, rather than a land mass. It's an interesting thing that is probably studied in great depth somewhere. I might go read about that. So Manannan Mac Art was the Celtic god characterised as the prankster, as well as the original Old Man of the Sea. He was often described as being white-haired and see-through skin, and having see-through skin through which seaweed could be seen. His hair and feet were always dripping wet. He would appear and disappear into the mists. He was a guardian of those who ventured to sea. So he has a prankster and a benevolent side, is I think one of the interesting aspects here, very much like Loki of Norse mythology. And later on within Christianity he becomes demonized, and we will touch on that at the end. And it's interesting how any god with a prankster element often becomes a real negative association, because the balance is then lost. And it happens when you see them become fae as well. Any female deity with a sexual side, an overt sexual side, becomes a tempting fae, you know, that leads men astray and things like that. Guardian of those who ventured to see. We don't often talk about it, but the reason to appeal to certain gods is fairly universal. People would pray to certain gods for certain things. So you take it from Greek, and they'd worship Aphrodite in matters of love. And here we have Manannan being petitioned by those who ventured to sea, and the sea, of course, being in Celtic times quite treacherous, even now very treacherous, but you know, back then even more so, and all-encompassing and expansive to the point where people could get lost and die and quite easily, and didn't have, I don't know if saying they didn't have as much awareness of the oceans and things as they do now is fair, but you know, we take travel for granted now, and it was more of a epic journey perhaps back then. Manannan was said to have tempted the Adultery High King Cormac Mac Art with a great treasure, if he, Cormac, promised to give him, Manannan, whatever he asked of him, Cormac, 3 times. Cormac agrees to this deal and receives the silver branch with solid gold apples that Manannan tempted him with. In return for the golden apples, Manannan first asked Cormac for his only daughter, and then his only son, and then his wife. Cormac finally realised he had lost his entire family for silver and gold, and pursued Manannan with an army. Manannan led Cormac through a thick mist where all his companions were lost, and he alone stood in Tir Nanog, realm of the gods. Here he was taught a harsh lesson, but his wife and children were restored to him. Manannan showed him the 5 streams of knowledge filled with salmon, who ate hazelnuts. He told him true knowledge and wisdom comes from the land of the Tir Nanog, the land of the gods. He rewarded him with a magic cup which would break if 3 lies were told over it, and made whole again if 3 truths were spoken over it. The reign of Cormac Mac Art is known as one of the most wise and filled with justice. He is known in Ireland as the lawgiver and one of Ire's great Adultery. Now, I'm just having a look because it must not be in this part, because I read did I not write it down? That was unfortunate. Aha! I did write it down. The one belonging to Manannan was made from the apple tree. In the Celtic stories, the apple, with or without him, had the ability to bring the traveller to the land of the departed. The land of the dead, in a symbolic sense, mirrors the death of the ego found in Zen Buddhism. It is this same death of self that many spiritual practitioners would call enlightenment. The otherworld is frequently connected to Manannan. the paradise of the Celts, was more likely in their minds to be on the horizon of the sea than up in the air. And from Living Library. So two very, well, there's many interesting points. There's the point about the possibility of the horizon of the sea being likely to be the entrance into the otherworld in the mind of the Celts, connecting water again to the otherworld. And we have seen this in many other myths, that the rivers were believed to be sort of, not portals, but they sort of led into the otherworld, and how the realm of water was all tied up with the subconscious, the psyche, the emotions, and even in symbolism today we still, you know, keep that water is so connected to our emotions and is used for divining and things like that, to access it, to consider it to be a conduit into the other world. And Manannan is the old man of the sea, so he is connected with this other world, and he engages Cormac to basically have this death of the self, this death of ego, by taking from him what should matter most to him, his family, his children, by tempting him with great treasure, and eventually rewarding him for coming to the realization of what is important. Not unlike the other stories from gods we've heard of them testing heroes and testing kings. It's sort of a very roundabout sort of trickster way of doing it. It's not as straightforward. It's a bit like the sea itself, a little bit murky. The motivations aren't apparent immediately, but they become clear. And following on from this, Manannan was said to have often appeared as an old fool dressed as a beggar. He would play tricks by claiming to have magical powers and demonstrating simple feats such as claiming he could wiggle one ear while the other remained still, and then he would demonstrate his unique ability. He would use one hand to wiggle his ear. If he was mocked, he would then show tremendous ability and would take the life and restore it of the person who mocked him. Again, cementing his role as trickster, prankster, but then gives real power behind the illusion of power. So we have the trick, the joke, and then if somebody engages with him in a bad way, then he shows what real power actually is. And restoring is sort of teaching a lesson. It's like, don't be judgeful. And don't give in to these weaknesses of mockery and not realizing what your family means to you in Cormac's tale. And then if they fail that, there is then a consequence. But quite frequently Manannan seems to bring that into a full circle and restore what was taken. It is also said that he played the clarsach Gaelic harp so beautifully it sounded as rushing waters. Music being connected with emotion and the ability to stir things within us. But quite frequently you see depictions of mermaids playing harps, actually, for similar reasons. Okay. I couldn't find the pronunciation of this, so I apologise if it's wrong. The Sergli Corn Cuchulainn, the sickbed of Cuchulainn, tells of Manannan's beautiful wife Fan and having an adulterous affair with Cuchulainn. When Fan sees that Emma, Cuchulainn's jealous wife, is also an accomplished warrior who approaches with an army of fighting women, Fard quickly returns to Manannan, pleading for his protection. Manannan shook his magical cloak of mists between vowed and Cuchulainn, and they never met again, presumably saving his adulteress's wife's neck in the process. I couldn't find much more about that than was addressed there, and it was one of those situations which was interesting, because you never really... I have yet to gauge how much of a punishment was put on things like adultery, but from the Celts it doesn't often come up. Presumably it was very dishonourable, and her behaviour here is incredibly so. But then he protects her whilst also stopping her from engaging in the behaviour ever again. So he sort of protects her and punishes her at the same time. Manannan has strong ties to the Isle of Man, where he is referenced in a traditional ballad as being the nation's first ruler. Each midsummer night the Manx people offered bundles of reeds, meadow grasses and yellow flowers to Manannan in a ritual paying of the rent. The offerings were accompanied by prayers for his aid and asking for mist-filled winds for farming and fair weather for fishing. So that's just a little bit of demonstration of ritual of giving gifts, and frequently they gave gifts into water for gods associated with rivers and the sea, and prayers and offerings. And then we have, last but not least, the tale I was talking about. The often repeated tale of Manannan and Columbkille's broken chalice reveals a great deal about the transition from Celtic Druid belief to Christianity. Colum had a broken chalice he sent with a servant to be repaired. The servant was met on the road by Manannan, who asked if the servant had need of anything. As we mentioned, he's known for his benevolence as well as his pranksters side. The servant showed him the broken chalice, which was mended with one mist-filled breath from Manannan's lips. He then instructed the servant to return to Colum, tell him what he had done, what he had seen, and ask if there was a place for someone with his abilities in the Christian kingdom. Colum denounced this as an act of sorcery and demanded the servant go throughout the land proclaiming Manannan as demon, who would spend eternity in hell. When Manannan heard his acts of kindness were not acceptable, he proclaimed, "I have watched over Isle from the time of the Tuatha De Danann. I have protected those on the seas and those of the isles. If I am no longer welcome, then I will go to the Isles of Scotland instead, where I am welcome." And so it is today that those who look for the protection of Manannan are no longer found in Isle or Man, but on the outer islands of Scotland. From clandonaldheritage.com. Which is fascinating. A story about the transition with the upcoming influence of Christianity, and how the demonization of Manannan comes about, and how he leaves what he has protected for so long. And we had hints of him being primordial, of going beyond Celtic belief, going back further into history. And at the point where Christianity becomes prevalent, he, in this myth, leaves completely. He sort of throws up his hands and says, if you're going to treat my acts of kindness in such a revolting manner, then I'm going to leave and you've lost me for good. Which is interesting in itself, to completely reject acts of benevolence is to completely lose them, to lose goodwill, which is interesting and not unknown, not unheard of within other Celtic god myths. I mean, you incur the wrath of Morrigan, for example, but it's in the myths it's quite dire, the consequences. But in the stories of Manannan, in all the others, there has been that sort of balance that, to try and teach people a lesson, to try and come full circle, to try and balance trickster and benevolence, to try and balance punishment and love. And in this final story, with the rejection of him, by the calling of him something which he is not, calling him evil, denouncing him, he just throws up his hands and says that's it. So there is a line of what is acceptable, which is different and fascinating. I haven't engaged with this god on a more personal level. I can't give more personal examples. It became very apparent that this was the one this week because of the connection to the ogre, which is apple this week, the quote. And the relationship between knowledge, wisdom and the sea, as well as the emotions and the emotional side of apple and then the sea, as well as quite frequently female fairy types tempting men, heroes of Celtic legend, over the sea. Not unlike Manannan tempts Cormac himself. There are other examples, Bran being one we've already mentioned, where a fey woman lured him away over the sea with a silver branch of apple blossom, where he spent, I think it was a year in bliss, and then wanted to come back and realised that they couldn't, and so much time had actually passed. He manages to go back in time, or some magical means to sort it out, but everybody else cannot. And there was another example. Was there another example? No. That was it for Over the Seas. But Over the Seas being engaging into the realm of the Fae, or the Tuatha De Danann, as we've seen, because of the sort of relationship between the Fae and the gods of old, which we've discussed in depth. So there's this fascinating relationship between the sea and sort of the other world, which we've discussed, and then looking into oneself for knowledge and wisdom and truth. Manannan sort of tries to teach us lessons about what is true, and true being one of those words. What is subjectively true for us, what matters most to us, what should matter more. And in the case of Cormac, it's supposed to be his family, the love he is supposed to bear is supposed to be more important to him. And through this trial, he becomes noted through history, through myth, as being a great high king, a king of justice and truth and wisdom and a lawgiver. And only through the trials that he himself has been through at the hands of Manannan does he become that. And that's a theme which we can pick here, there and everywhere from a lot of Celtic myths, you know, of sovereigns having to overcome their own trials and battles, to overcome what's lacking in them. Like last week, the spear story. Oh goodness. No, it wasn't last week. Last week was Rhiannon. I know it was Gwael. Not Gwael, Grom. And Lou? Yeah. Goron and Lou. Where the king has to overcome his failures, his failings, the things that aren't going to stand him in good stead for ruling and being a sovereign of the people of the land. And sea and land are connected quite intimately in Celtic myth. They're sort of almost inseparable, even in the realms of the sea. So we've covered justice, we've covered his myths. And the onset of Christianity and stuff is fascinating, how that has become part and parcel of the mythos. So yeah, so that's going to be it for this week. Again, I haven't engaged with him on a more personal level, so I can't offer huge insights on a more personal note, but I definitely found it incredibly interesting again this week. Many blessings.